Today's loaf is easy and versatile. It's a 50-50 blend of whole grain and white bread flour. If you're baking for a large family or gathering at people where tastes tend to range widely, like Thanksgiving, this bread is likely to have broad appeal. It works well for us, where I tend to prefer a predominantly whole grain bread, but our 4-year-old grandson, whose preferences lean more towards the white bread end of the spectrum, also likes it a lot. As with the other loaves in the episode 1 videos, I'm going to start with a couple cups of water. Normally this is where I'd mix in some sourdough starter, but for the sake of showing something different and keeping with the theme of easy, I'm going to add a half a teaspoon of instant yeast instead. Not everyone has the time or desire to maintain a sourdough starter, but anyone can easily keep some commercial instant yeast on hand. I happen to be using BioReal brand instant yeast from Germany because I'm an organic snob. And normally you mix instant yeast in with the dry ingredients, but I found that this works just as well by adding it into the water first. There's half a teaspoon. Now I'll add flour until it's somewhere around the consistency that I want. Since I don't know how much total flour that's going to be, I'll alternate adding white and whole grain flour. The usual 1.5 teaspoons of salt. Now I'll let it rest for 10 minutes to allow time for the flour to absorb the water. The whole grain portion of the flour I'm using today happens to be a blend of kamut, emmer, and einkorn, 3 of the most ancient grains. But you can use almost any single or blend of whole grain flour you want. After the 10-minute rest, I can see that the dough is already about where I want it. It may even be a little stiffer than I like. So I may add a bit more water during the stretch and folds. We'll see. Now, this dough is particularly well suited to accommodating additional ingredients. At this point, while the dough is still pretty wet, is a good time to add them. For example, if you want a Parmesan olive bread or a cranberry pecan bread, add those ingredients now. If you want a light rye bread, use rye flour as most of your whole grain flour, and toss in a couple tablespoons of caraway seeds here. The options are really limitless. I'll just go straight into the stretch and folds now. So I'll wet my hand so the dough doesn't stick too much. And if I do want the dough a little wetter, just the moisture from my wet hands could be all the difference I need. So there's the first of 3 stretch and folds. And I'm going to wait 10 minutes at least between the stretch and folds. You can go as long as 20 or 30. In fact, 20 or 30 might even be better for the dough development. Now the second stretch and fold. And now the third and final stretch and fold before we leave it until tonight. But now the dough is pretty smooth and silky, which is what you'd kind of expect from a dough with this much white flour in it. Okay, it's early evening and you can see the dough has risen really well. Hopefully it's not overproofed. Now we'll shape it for a short second rise and bake it. This dough is really pretty wet. I'm going to kind of wrestle it into the proofing basket without degassing it too much. Wow, it's wet. And let it proof for about another hour, probably at the most. It's pretty warm today. All right, hasn't even been quite an hour and the dough is definitely ready to go in the oven. In fact, it might be a little overproofed. It's real poofy. The instant yeast definitely moves a lot faster than sourdough starter. Wow, it is really wet. Sometimes I have difficulty scoring dough when it's super wet. We'll see how this goes. Oh yeah. It's hard not to tear it when it's really wet, and that's just what I did. Okay, and after 15 minutes, take the lid off, give it about another 20. I'm baking at 500 degrees, by the way. All right, it's been about 22 minutes since I took the lid off. It's definitely done. I'll let this bread cool for about an hour, and then we'll slice it and see what the inside looks like. While it's cooling, let's critique this baby. First of all, I didn't get as much oven spring as I'd really like. That's the rise that takes place after you put the dough in the oven to bake. And it looks cool when the slash in the top really opens up like a bloom. And I think that could be from one or both of a couple things in this case. I probably overproofed the dough, so there wasn't much oomph left in the yeast when I put it in the oven to bake. I also don't think that I degassed it, which is punching down the dough, enough after the long rise. So there wasn't much room left for it to spring back after I put it in the oven. And it was probably a combination of both things. This is the loaf I baked yesterday using the same 50-50 blend of whole grain and white flour, but with sourdough leavening instead of instant yeast. Only I got the timing right, so it's just a lot better looking loaf of bread. This loaf will be just fine. It's just not quite as good looking as I'd like it. The loaf is cooled, so let's check out the crumb. It's predictably a lot lighter than a loaf that's all whole grain and likely to get inhaled in the course of the next 24 hours. The next in our Easy Bake series will be a wonderful sandwich loaf. Thanks for watching.